As Melissa scanned the cabin, her gaze landed on the man in 2A. Hoodie, scuffed sneakers, completely out of place in first class. She stepped toward him, ready to demand his ticket, but before she could open her mouth, the intercom crackled. "We're honored to have Mr. Donovan Mitchell, the owner of this airline, on board today." Her heart skipped. She had just sized up and dismissed the billionaire who owned the very plane she was working on. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at the busiest airport on the East Coast. Travelers bustled through the terminal, rolling suitcases and clutching coffee cups as they hurried through security. Among them, a man moved with quiet ease, blending into the crowd in a simple hoodie, joggers and worn sneakers. Nothing about him screamed wealth or power, yet if you looked closely, you'd notice something about his demeanor. Calm, unbothered, the kind of stillness that comes with someone who holds the world in his pocket. He made his way through the terminal without fanfare, moving as though he were just another traveler. The gate attendant barely glanced at him as she scanned his boarding pass, ushering him toward the jet bridge leading to the first-class cabin. Nothing about him seemed out of place. As he boarded the plane, the man glanced around the first-class cabin, settling into seat 2A by the window. He tucked his backpack under the seat and pulled out his phone, ready for just another routine flight. For him, it was a workday like any other. He'd taken this journey hundreds of times before. But to the flight attendant assigned to first class, something felt off the moment she saw him. Dressed casually, with none of the designer clothes or sleek luggage she was used to seeing in this part of the plane, he didn't fit the image of the first-class passengers she typically served. To her, he looked out of place, like someone who had wandered into the wrong section by mistake. Her day had already been hectic. Delayed flights, unruly passengers, and endless requests had worn her down. So when she spotted the man in seat 2A, she immediately assumed there had been a mistake. Without checking the manifest or asking for his boarding pass, she made a snap decision, one that would set off a chain of events she could never have anticipated. She approached him with a practiced smile, the kind that hid irritation. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her tone polite but firm. "I believe you're in the wrong seat. This is first class." The man looked up from his phone, his expression calm. He smiled faintly and replied, "I believe I'm in the right place." Her patience, already thin from a long day, was wearing down further. His calmness irritated her. Leaning in slightly, she lowered her voice as if trying to save him from embarrassment. "Sir, this section is for first-class passengers. You'll need to move back to economy." There was no hint of anger or offense in his eyes, only quiet amusement. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to her. She glanced at it, expecting to find some error, but there it was, clearly printed. First class, seat 2A. For a moment, her heart skipped, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face, but she quickly brushed it off. Maybe he had been upgraded at the last minute. It didn't matter. She forced another smile. "Very well," she muttered, handing back the ticket. "Enjoy your flight." As she turned to walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that he still didn't belong. The man returned to his phone, unfazed by the encounter. He had been through this before. Assumptions, microaggressions, the casual glances of doubt. But this time he knew something she didn't, that they were both about to learn a lesson neither would soon forget. The first-class cabin filled quickly as passengers trickled in, their suitcases clicking into overhead compartments. The hum of conversation floated through the air, blending with the quiet sounds of boarding routines. The flight attendant tried to shake off her irritation as she checked the cabin one more time, ensuring everything was in place. Yet her gaze kept drifting back to seat 2A. He wasn't making demands or causing any disruptions. In fact, he seemed annoyingly calm, scrolling through his phone as if he were in his own world. But there was something about him that she couldn't let go. He didn't fit the mold. No luxury watch, no designer bag, no hint of status that usually accompanied first-class travelers. To her, he felt like an anomaly, a loose thread in the carefully woven fabric of what first class should look like. Passengers continued boarding, and she found herself glancing at him again. Why wasn't he drinking champagne or asking for a hot towel? Why didn't he have a business-class air about him? And why, she wondered, did that make her so uneasy? Her thoughts spiraled as she unconsciously sought to justify her discomfort. The final boarding call echoed over the intercom, signaling that the flight would soon be airborne. As the last passenger stowed their bag and settled in, the flight attendant made her way down the aisle one more time. She didn't have a reason to return to 2A, but her gut wouldn't let it go. She paused beside him, her forced smile barely masking her unease. "Sir," she began again, softer this time, "are you sure you're in the right seat? It happens more often than you'd think." The man looked up, his eyes calm but with a flicker of disappointment, as if he'd encountered this scenario more times than he cared to remember. Yet his voice remained steady. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm in the right seat." Around them, a few passengers perked up, sensing the subtle tension. A middle-aged businessman sitting across the aisle glanced over, curious. An older woman behind the man in 2A leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust her blanket but clearly interested in the exchange. The flight attendant's professional smile grew tighter. She crossed her arms as if bracing for a confrontation. "Look, sir," she said, keeping her voice measured. "This is first class. I just want to make sure there's no confusion." The man leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. There was no anger in his expression, only patience, as though he had been through this before. He pulled out the same boarding pass and handed it to her again. She scanned it once more, her frustration mounting. The ticket was valid. First class, seat 2A. The details hadn't changed, and yet something about him still didn't sit right with her. The disconnect gnawed at her, a gnawing she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. A businessman nearby, watching the scene unfold, spoke up. "Why don't you just show her the ticket again, buddy? Might save us all some time." He chuckled, a touch condescending, as if amused by the absurdity of it all. The man in 2A smiled faintly, not at the businessman but at the situation itself, as if it were a familiar play he knew by heart. Without a word, he handed the boarding pass back to the flight attendant, who took it with a frustrated sigh. She handed it back, forcing herself to maintain composure. "Apologies, sir. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order." He nodded once and resumed scrolling through his phone, as though the encounter had barely registered. But the discomfort lingered, thick and undeniable. Around them, passengers exchanged looks, some amused, others uneasy, all aware that something was off. As the flight attendant walked away, her thoughts churned. It wasn't just about him. It was about everything. The long hours, the demanding passengers, the constant feeling that her efforts went unnoticed. And now, this man, sitting calmly in 2A as if he had nothing to prove, was throwing her off balance. In the galley, she confided in a fellow flight attendant. "There's something weird about that guy in 2A, she muttered. Her colleague glanced toward the cabin, curious. "Weird how?" "I don't know. He just doesn't seem like he belongs there. Something's off." Her colleague gave her a look, half concerned, half skeptical. "Maybe he's just having a quiet day." "Maybe," the flight attendant murmured, though she didn't believe it. Something about the man's quiet presence felt unsettling, as if he were waiting for something she couldn't quite grasp. Back in the cabin, the man in 2A remained composed, sipping water when the drink service began. Other passengers continued to steal glances at him, their curiosity piqued by the earlier exchange. But he paid them no mind, scrolling through emails with the serene patience of someone who knew exactly how things would unfold. As the flight progressed, the tension between the flight attendant and the man simmered beneath the surface. Every time she walked past his seat, her mind raced with questions. Why didn't he react like most passengers would? With indignation or annoyance? Why was he so calm, so composed? An hour into the flight, a slight turbulence shook the cabin, causing the flight attendants to pause their service and return to their jump seats. In the galley, the flight attendant found herself beside her colleague again. "Still thinking about 2A?" the other attendant asked, her tone light but curious. The flight attendant huffed quietly. Yeah, I feel like he's waiting for something. Her colleague gave her a puzzled look. Like what? I don't know, she admitted. Just something. And then, as if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We're honored to welcome a special guest on board. Mr. Donovan Mitchell, thank you for choosing to fly with us. We hope you enjoy your flight. The flight attendant froze, her heart dropping into her stomach. Donovan Mitchell. The name echoed in her mind, each syllable heavy with meaning. She turned toward 2A, her breath catching in her throat. The pieces clicked together and the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had spent the last hour subtly doubting, questioning and scrutinizing the man who not only belonged in first class, but owned the entire airline. Her hands trembled as embarrassment flooded her senses. The weight of her assumptions, her judgment and her behavior now pressed down on her like a stone. She had made a mistake, one that could not be undone with a simple apology. As the man in 2A continued to sip his water, unfazed by the announcement, the flight attendant felt her world shift. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Her colleague, sensing the gravity of the situation, shot her a knowing look. Tough break, she murmured quietly. The flight attendant swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain. This was a flight she would never forget. The air in the cabin seemed to change after the announcement. Conversations grew quieter, and passengers exchanged curious glances, each person processing the sudden revelation. Donovan Mitchell, one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the business world, was sitting among them, dressed like an ordinary traveler, without an entourage or any sign of luxury. The flight attendant remained rooted in the galley, her heart pounding. A wave of disbelief washed over her. She had dismissed him, doubted him, treated him like he didn't belong, only to discover that he owned the very airline she worked for. Panic fluttered in her chest. How had she missed it? She knew his name, had heard of his success, his rise from nothing to billionaire status, yet she had never imagined that he would look like that. Her colleague leaned against the counter beside her, shaking her head with a knowing smile. You've got to admit he played it cool. The flight attendant could only nod, too stunned to respond. Donovan Mitchell had shown no hint of irritation, no anger, just calm patience, as if he'd been waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. And now it had. She peeked out from the galley, her gaze falling on Donovan. He sat as calmly as before, scrolling through his phone, seemingly unaffected by the attention. Yet the weight of her mistake pressed down on her. She knew the passengers around him must have picked up on her behavior earlier, and now they were likely connecting the dots. Her stomach churned with shame. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. It was about the assumptions she had made, the prejudices she had carried, and the subtle ways they had shaped her actions. She had treated him differently, and now everyone knew it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back into the cabin, her legs unsteady. As she walked past rows of curious passengers, she felt the weight of their silent judgments. A few exchanged amused glances as if to say, "You really messed up this time." When she reached Donovan's seat, she forced herself to speak. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, leaning slightly toward him. Her voice, usually steady, wavered. I'd like to apologize." Donovan looked up from his phone, his expression neutral but attentive. "For what?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, but the words felt stuck. What could she say? That she had judged him by his clothes, by the way he looked? That she had assumed he didn't belong in first class without ever bothering to ask or think beyond appearances? "For the way I treated you earlier," she finally managed. "It was unprofessional. I'm sorry." Donovan's gaze didn't waver. He studied her for a moment, his expression calm and unreadable. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" The question struck deeper than she expected, and she realized that her earlier apology hadn't addressed the heart of the issue. It wasn't just about professionalism. It was about prejudice, about assumptions she hadn't even known she carried until now. She began again, feeling her throat tighten. I made a lot of assumptions about you. That was wrong of me. I shouldn't have treated you differently. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you for saying that. The flight attendant's shoulders sagged with relief, though the knot of guilt in her stomach remained. If there's anything I can do to make this right. Donovan shook his head gently. It's not about making it right. It's about recognizing it. That's a good place to start. She felt the weight of his words settle over her, heavy but fair. There was no anger in his voice, no demand for reparation, just a quiet insistence on acknowledgement, on seeing things for what they were. As she turned to leave, she caught the eye of the businessman across the aisle, who gave her a knowing smirk. The message in his expression was clear. You just got schooled. Back in the galley, the flight attendant leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She replayed the interaction over and over in her mind, the calm way Donovan had responded, the lack of anger or arrogance. His grace, she realized, was more disarming than any confrontation would have been. Her colleague gave her a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Rough day, huh? The flight attendant let out a shaky laugh, though it lacked humor. You could say that. Hey, look at it this way, her colleague said with a grin. At least he didn't fire you on the spot. The flight attendant managed a weak smile, though the thought hadn't even occurred to her until now. Would Donovan Mitchell take action against her once the flight landed? Would she be called into her supervisor's office, forced to explain her behavior? She had no way of knowing. All she could do was carry the weight of her actions and hope that the lesson she'd learned today would stay with her long after the flight touched down. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, the flight attendant stood quietly in the galley, lost in thought. Her mind drifted to moments in her life when she had been judged unfairly, times when people had assumed things about her based on appearances or circumstance. She had always prided herself on rising above those experiences, on being better than the people who had judged her. And yet today, she had fallen into the same trap she had spent so much of her life avoiding. It was a sobering realization. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence as the flight continued westward. And for the first time in a long time, the flight attendant found herself thinking deeply about the person she had become, and the person she still wanted to be. Donovan Mitchell wasn't supposed to succeed. At least, that's what the world had tried to tell him. He grew up on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood where dreams were often deferred and ambition was a luxury few could afford. His father was absent, leaving his mother, Cecilia Mitchell, to raise him and keep their small apartment afloat. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses by day and waitressing at night, her hands calloused and her body tired, but her spirit unyielding. People will try to make you feel small, she would tell Donovan. But you hold your head high. You don't give them the power to tell you who you are. Those words became a mantra that he carried through every challenge life threw at him. Even as a young boy, Donovan was different. While other kids spent their weekends playing in the streets, he found refuge in the local library, devouring books on science, technology, and entrepreneurship. The library became his second home, a place where he could dream without limits. The librarians knew him by name, often sneaking him snacks from their lunches. They saw something in him that few others did. An insatiable hunger to rise above his circumstances. At 14, Donovan saved every penny he earned from odd jobs, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, and running errands, to buy a second-hand computer. It was old and slow, but it became his most prized possession. He spent hours taking it apart, learning how each component worked and putting it back together. By the time he was 16, he was writing code and building websites for small businesses in his neighborhood. But life in his neighborhood wasn't easy. Violence was a constant shadow. Friends he grew up with were pulled into gangs, drugs, or worse. Some never made it past their teenage years. Donovan stayed on the path his mother had set for him, determined to rise above the streets that had claimed so many. He graduated high school with top honors, earning a partial scholarship to a prestigious university. But even with financial aid, he couldn't afford the books, the housing, or the extra fees. His mother, though proud of him, couldn't make the numbers work. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered one night, tears in her eyes. "We just don't have it." It was a crushing blow, but Donovan didn't let it stop him. If college wasn't in the cards, he would find another way to succeed. He worked as a delivery driver by day and repaired computers at night, slowly building his savings. In his spare time, he developed Simplifies, a bookkeeping app for small businesses. It started small, just a side project to solve a problem he noticed in the businesses around him. But word spread quickly. Simplify became popular among local shops, and soon Donovan was receiving calls from businesses across the city. 2 years later, he sold Simplify to a major software company for a 6-figure sum. With that money, he moved his mother out of their old neighborhood and bought her a modest house in a safer part of the city. But Donovan wasn't satisfied. He didn't just want to escape his circumstances. He wanted to build something meaningful. Over the next decade, he built a business empire, investing in tech startups and launching his own venture capital firm. But his most ambitious move came when he acquired an airline on the brink of bankruptcy. Friends told him he was crazy. Airlines were notoriously difficult to run, even for seasoned executives. But Donovan saw something others didn't: an opportunity to change the way people experienced air travel. He overhauled the airline from the ground up, focusing on efficiency, customer service, and, most importantly, respect. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, judged by appearances, and underestimated. He wanted his airline to be a place where every passenger, regardless of status or background, was treated with dignity. The transformation was swift and remarkable. Under Donovan's leadership, the airline became known for its inclusive policies and stellar service. He implemented diversity training for all employees and introduced customer service standards that emphasized empathy and respect. But Donovan never sought public credit for the turnaround. He traveled anonymously, sitting among passengers in every class to experience the service firsthand. He didn't need recognition or special treatment. He just wanted to ensure that the values he had built the airline on were lived out every day. And yet, despite all his success, Donovan knew that the money couldn't shield him from prejudice. Even as a billionaire, he encountered assumptions and biases. Hotel clerks who eyed him suspiciously, luxury shopkeepers who followed him too closely, flight attendants who doubted his place in first class. It was a pattern he had lived through time and time again. But over the years, Donovan had developed a strategy: let people reveal who they really were. He didn't correct them immediately when they made assumptions. He let them sit in their ignorance, giving them the chance to recognize their mistakes. If they did, he allowed them the dignity of learning from the moment. If they didn't, he moved on, unbothered, but always taking mental notes. This strategy wasn't about revenge. It was about change. Donovan believed in second chances. After all, he had been given a few along the way. Everyone carried biases, he knew, whether they admitted it or not. What mattered was whether they confronted those biases once they were exposed. And so, when the flight attendant approached him on this flight, questioning whether he belonged in first class, Donovan wasn't surprised. He had seen this scenario play out before, and he knew exactly how it would end. He could have corrected her immediately. A single phone call, and the airline staff would have scrambled to apologize. But Donovan wasn't interested in quick fixes. He wanted to see if the flight attendant would recognize her mistake on her own, or if she would double down on her assumptions. So he waited. He remained calm, polite, and unbothered, knowing that the truth would come out soon enough. And when it did, it wouldn't just be a lesson for the flight attendant. It would be a lesson for everyone watching. As the plane soared through the sky, Donovan leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He didn't need to demand respect. It would come on its own. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about him. It would be about every moment someone had been unfairly judged. every assumption, every dismissal, every sideways glance. This flight was a small part of a much larger story, and Donovan Mitchell was used to playing the long game. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin felt different now, almost tense. The flight attendant continued her rounds, but each time she glanced toward seat 2A, she felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Donovan Mitchell had remained calm, quietly sipping his water and scrolling through his phone. He hadn't raised his voice or drawn attention to himself, and yet the weight of her earlier actions pressed on her, heavy and unshakable. Passengers nearby had picked up on the subtle tension. The businessman across the aisle exchanged knowing glances with another traveler, their expressions hinting at quiet amusement. Others were more discreet, casting furtive looks at Donovan from behind their newspapers or screens, wondering who exactly this man was, and how they had all missed the signs. But it wasn't just the passengers who were watching. The flight attendant herself was caught in a loop of self-reflection. Each time she passed Donovan's seat, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How could she have misjudged him so completely? Why had she assumed that someone dressed in casual clothes didn't belong in first class? And most importantly, why hadn't she bothered to question her own assumptions before acting on them? Her thoughts swirled as she retreated to the galley, trying to shake off the growing sense of discomfort. But it followed her, clinging like a shadow. Her colleague noticed the change in her demeanor. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light but curious. The flight attendant hesitated, then shrugged. "Just thinking about something." The colleague gave her a look, waiting for more, but when none came, she let it go. "Well, we're almost halfway through, just keep your head up." The flight attendant nodded absently, though her mind was elsewhere. She thought back to the moment when she had first approached Donovan, the confidence with which she had assumed he was in the wrong. It wasn't just about his appearance, though that had played a part. It was about the image she had built in her mind of what a first-class passenger should look like, act like, be like. And Donovan hadn't fit that image. The realization hit her hard. She had judged him not by his actions or words, but by the clothes he wore and the assumptions she had made about his place in the world. She felt a wave of shame, followed by a flicker of something deeper. Recognition. This wasn't just about Donovan. It was about her too, about the way she had allowed biases to creep into her daily work, unnoticed but ever present. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and the more she thought about it, the more uncomfortable she became. As the flight continued, the tension in the air only seemed to grow. Every interaction she had with Donovan, no matter how brief or professional, felt charged. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was quietly observing her, waiting to see if she would acknowledge the mistake she had made. She brought him a refill of water, her hand shaking slightly as she placed the glass on his tray. He glanced up at her, his expression neutral but watchful, and she quickly looked away, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone polite but distant. She nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, sir. Let me know if you need anything else." But as she walked away, she could feel his gaze lingering on her, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that made her feel exposed. It was as if he could see straight through her mask of professionalism, straight to the guilt she was carrying. The whispers among the passengers had grown more frequent now. Some were quietly speculating about who Donovan Mitchell really was, while others seemed to be reflecting on the situation in their own way. The businessman across the aisle leaned toward his seatmate, murmuring something that earned a nod of agreement. Nearby, an older woman who had been watching the entire interaction with keen interest raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Well, this is certainly something." The flight attendant returned to the galley, her mind buzzing with thoughts she couldn't quite organize. She replayed the last few hours over and over, picking apart every interaction, every word exchanged, every glance shared, and with each replay, the weight of her error grew heavier. It wasn't until a while later, during a brief moment of quiet, that she finally allowed herself to admit it. She had messed up. And not just in the way she had handled the situation, but in the assumption she had allowed to guide her actions. Her colleague, noticing the troubled expression on her face, gave her a sympathetic look. "You okay?" The flight attendant exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "Yeah, I really screwed up today." Her colleague raised an eyebrow. "With who? A passenger?" The flight attendant nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah, the guy in 2A. I made some assumptions, and now I'm paying for it." Her colleague frowned, clearly curious. "What kind of assumptions?" The flight attendant hesitated, then sighed. "I assumed he didn't belong in first class, because of how he looked, and now I find out he owns the airline." Her colleague's eyes widened in shock, then softened with understanding. "Wow, that's rough." The flight attendant nodded, her voice heavy with guilt. "Yeah, it is." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the situation hanging between them. Then her colleague spoke again, her tone gentle. "Look, everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is how you handle it now. You've apologized, right?" The flight attendant nodded. "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like enough." Her colleague smiled faintly. "It never does, but owning up to it is a good start." The flight attendant nodded, though the knot of guilt in her chest remained. She knew her colleague was right. She had apologized, and Donovan had acknowledged it. But there was still something unfinished, something unresolved. And it wasn't just about him. It was about the way she saw the world, and herself. As the flight neared its final hour, the flight attendant took a deep breath and steadied herself. There was no going back now, no undoing what had been done. But there was still time to learn from it, to change how she moved forward. And perhaps in the quiet spaces between the turbulence and the service trays, that was the most important lesson of all. The rest of the flight felt surreal to the flight attendant. She moved through the motions, offering drinks, collecting trays, adjusting blankets, yet her mind remained fixated on Donovan Mitchell in seat 2A. The air between them had shifted, heavy with unspoken thoughts and unresolved tension. It was as if the cabin had become a stage, and everyone was waiting to see how the final act would unfold. Donovan, however, remained calm and composed. He responded to every polite offer with the same quiet grace. No demands, no anger, just a steady, unbothered demeanor. That unsettled the flight attendant more than anything. She had expected some kind of outburst, some show of frustration. Instead, he had given her nothing to latch onto, leaving her to wrestle with her own discomfort in silence. A sense of helplessness gnawed at her. Every time she caught a glimpse of him, scrolling through emails or glancing out the window at the clouds, she felt as though she had failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. She had always thought of herself as fair, open-minded, someone who treated all passengers equally. Yet the truth now stared her in the face. She had judged him, assumed things based on appearances, and treated him differently because of it. As she passed through the cabin with another round of service, a passenger leaned in close, whispering, "So, is that really Donovan Mitchell?" The flight attendant forced a polite smile. "Yes, sir, it is." The man shook his head in disbelief. "Wow. Can't say I saw that coming." She gave a small, tight-lipped nod and continued down the aisle. Neither had she. In the galley, her colleague smirked. "So how does it feel, serving the guy who owns the place?" The flight attendant gave a half-hearted laugh. "Terrifying." Her colleague chuckled. "Hey, at least he's not throwing his weight around. If I owned an airline, you'd better believe I'd be asking for more than water." The flight attendant smiled faintly, though the weight of the moment hadn't lifted. It was true. Donovan hadn't demanded anything special. In fact, his behavior had been so unremarkable that it had thrown her off completely. And that, she realized, was part of the problem. She had expected someone like him to behave a certain way. When he didn't, she had assumed he didn't belong. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent into Los Angeles. The flight attendant glanced toward seat 2A. Donovan sat quietly, unaffected by the hustle of passengers preparing for landing. His calmness seemed almost otherworldly, as if the events of the flight hadn't touched him at all. yet she knew they had. There was no way they hadn't. The flight attendant's heart pounded as she ran through what she might say once the plane landed. Would she try to apologize again? Would he even want to hear it? The thought of facing him again filled her with dread, yet she knew it was unavoidable. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin for final checks. As the plane descended, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Passengers exchanged hushed whispers, some sneaking glances at Donovan as if hoping for one last glimpse of the billionaire in disguise. The flight attendant adjusted her uniform, smoothing the fabric as if it would somehow help her feel more in control. But control was something she no longer had, not over the situation, not over the narrative playing out in her mind. When the wheels touched the ground, the cabin erupted into movement. Passengers retrieved their bags, stretched, and shuffled toward the aisle. The flight attendant stood at her post near the door, her pulse racing as Donovan rose from his seat. He moved with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout the flight, slinging his carry-on over one shoulder. As he stepped toward the exit, the flight attendant felt her throat tighten. This was her moment. Her last chance to say something meaningful, something more than a forced apology. "Mr. Mitchell," she blurted, her voice low but urgent. He paused, turning to face her. His expression remained calm, patient, as if he had all the time in the world. She began, faltering. "I just wanted to say thank you for your patience and for giving me a chance to see what I needed to see." Donovan studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, a small, genuine smile that held no trace of bitterness. "You're welcome," he said simply. The flight attendant felt a strange mixture of relief and gratitude wash over her. His words were few, but they carried weight. He wasn't angry. He wasn't looking for retribution. He had simply given her the opportunity to reflect, to learn, and to grow. As he stepped off the plane, the flight attendant stood quietly by the door, watching him disappear into the bustling terminal. She knew this flight would stay with her, not just as a story to tell, but as a lesson that would shape how she treated others moving forward. Her colleague joined her at the door, nudging her playfully. "Well, that was a trip, huh?" The flight attendant let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yeah, it really was." And as the last of the passengers filed off the plane, she stood a little taller, feeling lighter somehow. This wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something new. As the last passengers trickled off the plane, the flight attendant lingered in the galley, her thoughts swirling like the clouds they had flown through. She knew this flight had marked a turning point, not just in her career but in the way she saw herself and others. The hours spent in the air had forced her to confront the biases she hadn't realized she carried. And now, standing in the quiet aftermath, the weight of those realizations pressed heavily on her. Her colleague leaned against the counter beside her, giving a playful nudge. "So, what's the lesson today?" The flight attendant forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Don't judge a book by its cover," she offered with a weak laugh. Her colleague chuckled. "A classic, but seriously, you did okay. Everyone makes mistakes." "Yeah," the flight attendant murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "But not everyone makes them in front of the owner of the airline." Her colleague gave a sympathetic shrug. "True, but he didn't seem angry. That's something, right?" The flight attendant nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. Donovan's calm, measured demeanor had left a deeper mark than any reprimand ever could. It wasn't just that he hadn't been angry. It was that he had remained patient, graceful, even kind. He had given her space to recognize her own missteps, to reflect on her actions without forcing the lesson. And in doing so, he had made the lesson impossible to ignore. For years, she had prided herself on being professional, efficient, and fair. But now she saw the cracks in that image. She had allowed assumptions to slip through, shaping her actions in ways she hadn't acknowledged. The realization stung, and with it came a sense of guilt that felt heavier than turbulence. She thought back to her early days as a flight attendant, when she had been eager, compassionate, and full of energy. She remembered how she used to take extra time with nervous travelers or struggling parents, how she had once loved the little moments of connection that came with the job. Somewhere along the way, that love had faded, worn down by long hours and difficult passengers. Now, standing in the quiet of the empty plane, she wondered if it was too late to get that part of herself back. Her colleague gave her a pat on the shoulder. "Come on, let's finish up and get out of here. Long day." The flight attendant nodded, but before following her colleague, she took one last look at the seat where Donovan Mitchell had sat. It was empty now, just a seat like any other. And yet, it felt like the place where something important had happened, something that would stay with her long after the flight. She smoothed her uniform, took a deep breath, and stepped into the aisle. There were still tasks to complete, forms to fill out, reports to file. Life would go on just as it always did. But she knew, deep down, that something had shifted inside her. As she worked through the final checks, her mind drifted back to the conversation she had shared with Donovan. His words had been simple, but they had carried the weight of lived experience. It's not about making it right, it's about recognizing it. She knew now that her apology to Donovan wasn't just about him. It was about the future, about the kind of person she wanted to be moving forward. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to be that flight attendant again, the one who saw people, not just passengers. When the plane was finally empty and the paperwork completed, the flight attendant slung her bag over her shoulder and walked down the jet bridge. The terminal buzzed with the usual airport chaos, announcements, rolling suitcases, hurried travelers. But for once, she didn't mind. She felt a strange sense of peace, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been lifted. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from a friend asking how her shift had gone. She smiled faintly, typing back, "It was interesting. I'll tell you about it later." As she made her way through the terminal, her thoughts lingered on Donovan Mitchell. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, and truthfully, she didn't need to. What mattered was the lesson he had left behind, a quiet reminder that people are more than the assumptions we make about them, and that sometimes the most important growth happens in the smallest moments. The flight attendant stepped out into the cool night air, inhaling deeply. The world felt a little different now, more open, more complicated, but also more hopeful. And with that hope came a sense of determination. She wasn't perfect, and she would make mistakes again. But from this moment forward, she promised herself that she would try harder to see the person behind the seat, behind the uniform, behind the assumptions. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Donovan Mitchell walked through the terminal, he felt the familiar rhythm of the airport bustle around him. Announcements echoing overhead, the hum of luggage wheels against tile floors, and travelers hurrying to their gates. It was a scene he knew well, but this flight had left him with more to reflect on than usual. He moved through the crowd with ease, just as he always did. Blending in had become second nature to him, a skill he'd perfected over the years. Despite his success and wealth, he preferred to remain unseen, choosing not to draw attention to himself. The people around him had no idea who he was, and that was exactly how he liked it. This time, though, something about the encounter with the flight attendant stayed with him. The assumptions she had made, the way she had treated him differently, it was all too familiar. He had been here before, many times, in hotels, restaurants, stores, and airports, encountering the same subtle skepticism and misplaced judgments. What made this flight different, though, was the way the flight attendant had responded. She had apologized. She had recognized her mistake. And that, Donovan knew, was rare. Over the years, Donovan had learned that most people, when confronted with their biases, either doubled down or became defensive. It was easier to justify assumptions than to admit fault. But the flight attendant hadn't done that. She had taken the opportunity to reflect, to apologize, and to grow. And to Donovan, that was worth something. As he made his way through the terminal, his thoughts drifted to the countless moments in his life when he had been underestimated. From the teachers who doubted his abilities to the business partners who didn't believe in his vision, the pattern had been the same. People judged him by what they saw on the surface, never bothering to look deeper. But Donovan had stopped letting those moments define him a long time ago. Instead, he used them as fuel, turning every dismissal into motivation. He didn't need validation from others. What mattered to him was building something meaningful, a legacy that went beyond appearances. And that was why he had bought the airline. It wasn't just a business venture or a status symbol. It was a way to create change. He wanted his airline to be a place where people were treated with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. A place where dignity was the default, not a privilege. He had no illusions that the industry would change overnight. Bias ran deep, and it would take time to shift the way people thought and behaved. But every small moment counted. Every act of kindness, every apology, every step toward understanding. Those were the building blocks of something bigger. The encounter with the flight attendant was one of those small moments. She had made a mistake, yes, but she had also shown humility, and that was more than most people did. Donovan hoped that her apology wasn't just about easing her guilt, but about truly seeing things differently moving forward. He adjusted the strap of his carry-on bag, a small smile playing on his lips. It was a complicated thing, navigating the world as both an anonymous traveler and a public figure. There was freedom in invisibility, but also a kind of sadness knowing that people often revealed their true selves when they thought no one important was watching. But today that flight attendant had chosen to change, even when she didn't have to. And to Donovan, that mattered. As he reached the exit of the terminal, the cool breeze of the Los Angeles evening greeted him. He took a deep breath, savoring the quiet moment before stepping into the bustling world outside. There would be more flights, more encounters, more assumptions, but there would also be more opportunities. Opportunities for people to learn, to grow, and to rise above their biases. Donovan glanced around the terminal one last time, his thoughts lingering on the flight attendant. He didn't need to remember her name, and she probably wouldn't expect him to. But he hoped she carried this lesson with her, just as he carried every small act of grace that had shaped his own journey. With that, Donovan stepped into the night, blending into the crowd once more. He didn't need anyone to know his name or recognize his face. He had built a life that mattered not because of who people thought he was, but because of what he chose to do with the chances he'd been given. And as the city lights of Los Angeles flickered in the distance, Donovan Mitchell smiled to himself, knowing that this flight, like so many others, had been exactly what it needed to be. As Donovan left the terminal and stepped into a waiting car, his thoughts shifted from the flight to his past. He often reflected during quiet moments like these, between meetings, after flights, or in the solitude of a hotel room. His success had been hard-won, and the journey to get here was something he never took for granted. He remembered his childhood on the south side of Chicago, where life had been anything but easy. The streets he'd grown up on were filled with struggle. Opportunities were scarce, and many of the kids he had grown up with never made it out. Some fell into the traps of gangs or drugs. Others simply got lost in the grind of daily survival. But from a young age, Donovan had known he wanted something different. His mother had been his anchor. She worked endlessly to provide for him, her hands rough and worn from years of scrubbing floors and waiting tables. But she had never let him see her break. "You rise," she would always tell him. "No matter what they throw at you, Donnie, you rise." Those words had stayed with him throughout his life. They were the foundation of everything he had built, the strength to push through when doors were slammed in his face, the courage to dream bigger when others told him to settle for less. He thought back to the nights spent in the library, devouring books on business, technology, and entrepreneurship. It was there, among the shelves of outdated textbooks and flickering fluorescent lights, that Donovan had discovered the world of possibilities that lay beyond his neighborhood. He had taught himself to code on an old second-hand computer, taking it apart and rebuilding it until he understood every piece. That knowledge had become his ticket out, his way to rise. He remembered the first time he had walked into a boardroom full of executives, all of them older, wealthier, and more experienced than him. They had looked at him with skepticism, the same way the flight attendant had earlier. He hadn't been surprised. People had always doubted him because of where he came from, because of how he looked, because of the assumptions they made. But Donovan had learned to let their doubts fuel him, to use every underestimation as motivation. The acquisition of the airline had been one of his boldest moves, but also one of his most personal. He had seen it as a way to rewrite the rules, to create a company that reflected the values he had fought for all his life. Respect, dignity, empathy. Those were more than just business strategies to him. They were how he had survived, how he had thrived. As the car moved through the streets of Los Angeles, Donovan's mind wandered back to his early days as a young entrepreneur. He thought about Simplify, the bookkeeping software he had developed for small businesses. It had started as a side project, just something to keep him busy while he worked other jobs. But it had quickly grown, and before long he had turned it into a thriving business that caught the attention of larger companies. Selling Success Simplify had been a turning point, not just financially but mentally. It had shown Donovan that he could build something from nothing, that his ideas had value, even if the world hadn't been ready to see it yet. With that sale, he had moved his mother out of their old apartment and into a better neighborhood. It had been one of the proudest moments of his life, knowing that he had finally been able to give her something in return for all the sacrifices she had made. But success had never been the goal. For Donovan, it had always been about more than money. It had been about proving something, to himself, to his mother, and to the world, that he could rise no matter how many people tried to hold him down. Now, as the car rolled through the city streets, Donovan found himself thinking about the legacy he wanted to leave behind. It wasn't enough to build wealth or businesses. He wanted to create change, to leave the world better than he had found it. That was why he had stayed involved in his airline, even when he could have stepped back and let others run it. He wanted to make sure that the values he cared about were woven into every part of the company's fabric. Donovan's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from one of his team members confirming a meeting for the next day. He glanced at it briefly before tucking his phone back into his pocket. There would always be meetings, always be deals to make and businesses to run. But moments like this, when he could pause and reflect, were rare, and they mattered. He knew that his success hadn't come without cost. The road had been long, filled with obstacles that most people couldn't imagine. But he had made it through, and in doing so, he had learned something important. It wasn't about proving the doubters wrong. It was about proving himself right. The car pulled up to his hotel and Donovan stepped out, his mind still heavy with the weight of his memories. As he walked through the lobby, he thought once more about the flight attendant, about the way she had hesitated before apologizing. She hadn't needed to. Most people wouldn't have. But she had, and that was what mattered. He entered the elevator, thinking about how far he had come. The lessons he had learned on that flight were ones he had learned a long time ago. But maybe, just maybe, the flight attendant had learned something new today. The doors of the elevator closed, and Donovan smiled to himself. The journey wasn't over. It never was. But today he felt like he had taken another small step forward. And for him, that was enough. Back in the quiet of her apartment, the flight attendant, Melissa Davis, sat on the edge of her bed, replaying the events of the day in her mind. The entire flight had felt like a blur, but now in the stillness of her own space, it all came rushing back with sharp clarity. Her interactions with Donovan Mitchell, her assumptions, and the quiet way he had taught her a lesson she wasn't expecting. Melissa stared at her reflection in the mirror across the room. She didn't recognize the person she had been earlier that day, the one who had made snap judgments, who had let her biases dictate her behavior. She had always considered herself fair, professional, someone who treated every passenger with the same level of respect. But today had shattered that image. She stood up and walked over to the mirror, looking herself in the eyes. Who had she become? When had she started making assumptions about people based on their appearance? She wasn't raised like that. Her parents had always taught her to be kind, to see the person behind the surface. Yet here she was, ashamed of how easily she had slipped into patterns she had once sworn she would never adopt. Melissa's thoughts drifted back to her childhood, a simpler time when life hadn't felt so heavy. She had grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other, where you couldn't hide behind the anonymity of a city crowd. People were known by their character, by their actions, not by what they wore or how much money they had. Her father had been a factory worker, tough and weathered, but with a heart of gold. He always told her, "It doesn't matter who someone is or where they come from. You treat them the way you'd want to be treated, no questions asked." Her mother, a homemaker, had echoed the same sentiment. Melissa had carried those values with her when she first moved to the city to start her career as a flight attendant. But somewhere along the way, life had worn her down. The daily grind of dealing with difficult passengers, the long hours, and the constant pressure to meet expectations had chipped away at the compassion she once held so close. She had built walls around herself, made assumptions as a way to protect her own sanity. But those walls, she realized now, had done more harm than good. As Melissa sat back down on the edge of her bed, she thought about Donovan. She hadn't known who he was when she first saw him, and that had been her mistake. She had judged him by the way he dressed, by the way he carried himself, without ever bothering to see him for who he really was. And yet, despite her behavior, he hadn't lashed out. He hadn't embarrassed her or demanded an apology. He had simply let her see the truth for herself. It wasn't just his patience that had struck her. It was his grace. He had given her space to recognize her own faults, to reflect on her actions without ever making her feel small. That, Melissa realized, was true strength. He could have called her out, humiliated her in front of the entire cabin. But instead, he had treated her with more respect than she had shown him. She thought about the moment when she had apologized to him, how he had looked her in the eye and said, "It's not about making it right. It's about recognizing it." Those words had stayed with her, echoing in her mind long after the flight had landed. They had forced her to look deeper, to see that her apology wasn't enough on its own. It wasn't about saying the right thing to ease her guilt. It was about truly understanding where she had gone wrong. Melissa's heart ached with the weight of her reflection. She knew this wasn't something she could fix overnight. It was a part of herself she had to work on, something she had to unlearn. But she was grateful, in a strange way, for the opportunity to see it now, before it was too late. She reached for her phone, scrolling through social media mindlessly, hoping to distract herself from the heaviness of her thoughts. But every image, every post felt hollow. Nothing could shake the lesson she had learned today. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't something that should be easily forgotten. Melissa put down her phone and stared at the ceiling. What was it Donovan had said? It's about recognizing it. She had recognized her mistake, but now came the harder part. What to do with that recognition? It wasn't enough to feel bad, to reflect on it for one night and then move on. She had to change. But how? Melissa knew the answer, even if she didn't want to admit it. It started with small actions. It meant catching herself in those moments when she wanted to make assumptions, when she was tempted to judge someone before truly seeing them. It meant holding herself accountable, even when no one else was watching. And it meant being kinder, not just to others but to herself. She had always prided herself on being a hard worker, someone who could handle the stresses of the job without losing her cool. But now she saw that there was more to being good at her job than just getting through the day without making mistakes. It was about how she treated people, how she showed up in those small moments that no one else noticed. Melissa sighed deeply, feeling both heavy and light at the same time. Heavy with the weight of the lesson she had learned, but light with the knowledge that she had the power to change. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. She stood up from the bed and made her way to the kitchen, brewing a cup of tea to settle her racing thoughts. As the steam rose from the cup, she allowed herself a small smile. Today had been hard, it had been uncomfortable, but it had also been necessary. And as she sipped her tea in the quiet of her apartment, Melissa promised herself that tomorrow and every day after, she would do better. Because it wasn't about making it right. It was about recognizing it, learning from it, and rising above it. Just like Donovan had. Just like she could. Tomorrow was a new day, and Melissa was ready to meet it with a fresh perspective, a lighter heart, and a determination to rise. The next day, Melissa woke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of the previous day's events still lingered, but it was lighter now, replaced by a quiet determination. She knew change wouldn't happen all at once. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for it. As she got ready for her shift, Melissa made a conscious decision. Today, she wouldn't just go through the motions. She would be intentional in every interaction, with every passenger, no matter how small the moment might seem. She would approach each person with kindness, patience, and empathy, the same way Donovan had treated her. The airport was as chaotic as ever when she arrived for her shift. Travelers rushed from gate to gate, families wrangled children, and frustrated passengers grumbled about delays. It was the kind of day that would usually fray Melissa's nerves. But today, she felt different. She was determined to carry the lesson from yesterday into her work. Her first flight of the day was a short one, a 2-hour hop to Denver. As passengers boarded, Melissa greeted each one with a genuine smile. She made eye contact, asked how their morning was going, and listened to their responses, no matter how brief or distracted they seemed. An older woman struggling with her carry-on caught Melissa's attention. Normally, Melissa would have waited for the passenger to ask for help, but today, she stepped forward without hesitation. "Let me get that for you," she said, gently taking the bag and placing it in the overhead bin. The woman gave her a grateful smile. "Thank you, dear. My shoulders aren't what they used to be." Melissa smiled back. "Happy to help. If you need anything else, just let me know." It was a small gesture, but as Melissa returned to her post, she felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in a long time. These were the moments that mattered, the ones that often went unnoticed but left a lasting impact. The flight passed smoothly, with no major disruptions. As Melissa made her way down the aisle, checking on passengers, she noticed a young man with a nervous expression, his hands gripping the armrests. She paused beside him, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "First time flying?" she asked kindly. The man gave a shaky nod. "Yeah. I've never been on a plane before." Melissa smiled reassuringly. "You're doing great. It's normal to feel a little nervous, but if you need anything, just hit the call button, okay?" The man nodded, looking slightly more at ease. "Thanks." As Melissa continued her rounds, she felt something shift within her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. These moments of connection, however brief, were why she had become a flight attendant in the first place. It wasn't just about getting people from one place to another. It was about making them feel seen, valued, and cared for along the way. When the flight landed in Denver, Melissa stood at the front of the plane, thanking each passenger as they disembarked. The nervous young man gave her a small smile as he passed, and the older woman with the carry-on gave her a warm nod. As the last passenger left the cabin, Melissa allowed herself a moment to reflect. Today had been a good day, not because everything had gone perfectly, but because she had made a conscious effort to be better. And that, she realized, was what truly mattered. Back in the galley, one of her colleagues gave her a curious look. "You seem different today," she said, her tone playful. "Did something happen?" Melissa smiled softly. "Yeah," she replied. "Something did." Her colleague raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Good different or bad different?" Melissa thought for a moment, then nodded. "Good, definitely good." As they prepared the cabin for the next flight, Melissa felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She knew she wasn't perfect, and she would still make mistakes along the way. But she also knew that she was on the right path. One small step at a time, she was becoming the person she wanted to be, the kind of person who saw others for who they were, not who she assumed them to be. And as the boarding call for the next flight echoed through the cabin, Melissa smiled to herself, ready to meet whatever challenges the day had in store. Because change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And Melissa was just getting started. Weeks passed, and Melissa found herself reflecting on her encounter with Donovan Mitchell less often, but the lesson stayed with her. It became a quiet part of her routine, a subtle shift in the way she moved through her days. She noticed how easily assumptions could slip into her thoughts, but now she caught them before they took hold. With each flight, she became more intentional in her interactions, focusing on seeing people, not just passengers. Her colleagues began to notice the change in her. "You're different these days," one of them said during a layover in Chicago. "Not that you weren't good before, but there's something calmer about you." Melissa smiled. "I'm just trying to do things differently," she said simply. "It feels better this way." Though she never mentioned Donovan by name, that flight had marked the beginning of this new version of herself. It wasn't a transformation that others could easily see, but it was one she felt deep inside. A commitment to treating every person with the dignity they deserved, no matter how long or short their interaction. One evening, after a long-haul flight from New York to London, Melissa sat at the airport lounge scrolling through her phone. A message from an unfamiliar number appeared. "Hope you're well. I've been thinking about our flight. You're doing great. Keep going." It was brief, without any signature, but she knew exactly who it was. A small smile tugged at her lips as she reread the message. Donovan Mitchell hadn't forgotten her, and his words felt like a quiet reassurance, like a reminder that he saw her effort and believed in her journey, even from afar. Melissa tucked her phone into her pocket and sipped her coffee, feeling a warmth spread through her. She didn't need validation, not really. But it felt good to know that someone who had seen her at her worst now acknowledged the effort she was making to be better. On her next flight, Melissa welcomed a mother with 2 young children, their hands sticky with candy. The family looked frazzled, the kids tugging at their mother's sleeves, demanding snacks and attention. Melissa crouched to meet the kids at eye level. "Hey there. How about I show you where the snacks are on the plane?" she said with a playful smile. The children giggled, and their mother gave Melissa a grateful look, clearly relieved. "Thank you," the mother whispered as they settled into their seats. "It's my pleasure," Melissa replied warmly. Moments like these reminded her of why she loved this job in the first place. It wasn't just about getting people to their destination. It was about making the journey feel a little lighter, a little brighter. At the end of the flight, the grateful mother touched Melissa's arm as they exited the plane. "You made this so much easier," she said. "Thank you." Melissa smiled. "I'm glad. Safe travels." After the plane emptied, Melissa lingered in the aisle, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. These were small moments, tiny acts of kindness, but they mattered. They added up, and they were shaping her into the person she wanted to be. As she completed her post-flight checks, Melissa thought back to Donovan's message. She didn't know if their paths would cross again, and that was okay. His lesson had already left its mark. She had learned to confront her own assumptions, to approach the world with more empathy and less judgment, and that was enough. Later that night, as she sat in her hotel room, Melissa opened her journal and jotted down a few thoughts about the day. It had become a habit for her, a way to reflect and stay mindful of the changes she was trying to make. "Today I caught myself judging someone," she wrote. "But I stopped before it became more than a thought. Progress." She closed the journal with a contented sigh. The journey was far from over, but she was on the right path, and that was all that mattered. Before turning off the lights, Melissa glanced out the window at the city lights twinkling below. Every day was a new chance to be better than the day before, and tomorrow she would rise once again, just as Donovan had, just as she had promised herself she would. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying, and that, Melissa knew, was more than enough. With a peaceful heart, she turned off the light closed her eyes, and drifted into sleep, ready to face whatever came next. Melissa sat quietly on her bed, reflecting on the encounter that had shaken her to her core. What had started as just another routine flight had turned into a life-altering experience, one that forced her to confront her assumptions, biases, and the kind of person she truly wanted to be. The lesson Donovan Mitchell had imparted wasn't just about a mistake. It was about how small moments can define a person's character, how the way we treat others, even when no one's watching, says everything about who we are. It would have been easy for Donovan to humiliate her, to use his power and status to make an example of her in front of the passengers and crew. But he hadn't. Instead, he had offered her something far more valuable: grace. He had given her the space to reflect and recognize her own misjudgments, something she would carry with her long after the flight ended. Melissa knew that changing her behavior wouldn't happen overnight. She would have to unlearn old habits, confront the biases she hadn't realized she harbored, and choose empathy every day, even when it was hard. But today, she had taken the first step. She had recognized her mistake, apologized, and vowed to do better. That was all she could do: keep moving forward, one interaction at a time. From this day on, Melissa decided, she would treat every passenger with the dignity they deserved, whether they were dressed in a suit or a hoodie, sitting in first class or economy. Because it wasn't about appearances, status, or assumptions. It was about respect. And respect wasn't a privilege to be earned. It was a right to be given freely. As she closed her journal, a sense of peace settled over her. Life would always throw challenges her way, but she knew she was ready to face them with a fresh perspective and a lighter heart. Every flight was an opportunity to do better, to make someone's journey just a little easier, a little brighter. And that's the kind of person Melissa Davis was determined to be. What assumptions are you carrying with you today? Next time you encounter someone new, pause and choose to see the person, not the appearance. The journey to change starts with a single step. Are you ready to take yours?